you can help me out so I can preserve my voice. This is the most huge crowd we've ever had out to this thing, so I'm going to we have like 3 or 4 tables max, so I just feel like maybe I ought to order a pizza and turn it into a party. So let me pray. I do want to ask the Lord to bless our time and then share a few things. Lord, I'm thankful for just the chance, the opportunity to be here. I'm always grateful to see your people and their desire to know your word better and to explore it. And Lord, I'm thankful for the great spirit here on this campus and what you're doing in lives here. And I pray that this time, even though it's kind of outside the mainstream of the class, that it could be helpful, that it would be something that could spark our thinking, spur it on a bit further, and maybe even for some, it might launch them into further study that would go much deeper than what we can do in this brief time. So I'm asking for your help. I'm praying that it would be to your honor and glory. And I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So let me tell you real quick how this came about. This is not my sweet spot area of expertise, but over the years I was getting a lot of questions about it. And it forced me to do 2 things. One, it forced me to dig into this a little bit myself. And then secondly, it forced me to really kind of turn it into an aside piece, because there was no way really to take the time in the class to do it. So I started doing this little thing on the side, and here we are. It's pretty good attendance tonight, so thanks for coming out. So what I'd like to do is really a couple things. One is, for the most part, talk about this issue of the age of Earth's early inhabitants. But I'm going to use the chance to segue as I, more towards the end. I'd like to shift into something that's related to it that I also like to talk about, that I don't have time to talk about, and that is climate change. But not the climate change that we hear a lot about in our culture, but the climate change that would have almost certainly been the result of Noah's flood, and I think it's related to this topic. So I figure, you know what, you'll get a little bit of an extra piece that I just don't have the time to do in the class. And you know what, if you find it boring, I will not be offended if you stand up and walk out. It's fine. I'll just question what you're saying, but I won't. I'm just kidding. All right, so what's the issue on the table? The issue is that when you read Genesis 5, you're reading about people living into the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and even 900s years of age. I'm not going to read all of 5, but let me just read a few verses just to get the flavor. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. Then the days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. So we don't even know how many sons and daughters Adam and Eve had. So all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Seth lived 105 years and became the father of Enosh. Then Seth lived 807 years after he became the father of Enosh, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And on it goes. And of course, the most famous one of all would have to be Methuselah. And we often say he's the oldest man who ever lived. Actually, that's not totally accurate. It's the oldest man that we know of. There could have been somebody who lived longer than him the Bible didn't tell us about. Because when you hear about Methuselah, it's because it's giving you a genealogy to set up the story of the flood. So it's not giving you all the people who ever lived. So there could have been somebody who even surpassed the 969, I think it was, that Methuselah lived. So of course, these great ages recorded in Genesis are the subject of some debate, if not ridicule. I mean, clearly people could not live that long. I always like to say, well, what proves that they can? Well, because that's how it happens today. Oh, so that proves that it could never have been in the past. I think that's a pretty lame argument. But that being said, it does beg the question, like, are these long ages somehow possible? And maybe even more interestingly than that, what would have caused that to change? That might even be the more interesting question. So one of the ways in which people have tried to maybe deal with this is by saying, well, you know what, maybe their years were measured differently than ours. Like maybe a modern year was worth several of their years. Maybe they were counting it differently. And so some have proposed working on a sort of a ratio system where one of our modern years was equal a certain number of their years. But let's try that on for size and see how well it would work for just a couple of minutes. So let's just pretend, for example, that a modern year is worth 10 Genesis years. That would mean that Methuselah would die at age what? 96.9. That's reasonable. I mean, that is old even today, but it's doable. But if you play that game of math that way, it works for Methuselah, but watch how it starts to not work so well with other ages. Okay, watch this. So Seth lives to be at 105, he becomes the father of Enoch. So he's becoming a dad at 10.5 years of age. Modern age. Kind of a little weird. I suppose it's biologically possible for a 10-year-old to, biologically potentially possible. Enoch is a dad at 9 years of age. Kenon is a dad at 7 years of age. Abram is 7 years old when he leaves Ur to go to the promised land with his wife. So by playing the ratio game, you fix the challenge on one end of the spectrum, you just shift the challenge to the other end of the spectrum. It doesn't really seem to solve it. Abraham is beyond the childbearing years at 10 years of age. So he dies at 17. So people say, okay, well, let's try another ratio. Let's just play this game a couple more times. So a modern year, 8 Genesis year. He's a dad at 13. That I would say is doable. He's a dad at 11. It's getting a little weird. A dad at 8. Abram's 9 when he leaves Ur. He's 12 years of age. Hey, he can't have kids anymore. He dies at 21 years of age. I mean, that's somewhat reasonable, although we consider that's really young. Methuselah would have died at 121, if that's your ratio. So it's starting to push the envelope back again on the other end. Methuselah dying, still pretty old. Let's just try it one more time. 6 Genesis years. Seth, dad at 17. That's okay. Dad at 15, dad at 11. Abraham was 12 when he leaves Ur. Childbearing years at 16. He dies at 29 years of age. But now Methuselah is 161. Right? So just to make sure I bored you completely out of your skull, let's do it one last time. Okay, so one modern year is 2 Genesis years, a simple 2-to-1 ratio. Seth, the dad at 55, very good. 45, very good. 35, good. 37, it's kind of weird, but yeah, okay, he leaves Ur with his wife, doable. But he's beyond childbearing at 50 years of age. Abraham dies at 87 and a half. That's decent, but Methuselah's back up to 480. Yeah. So clearly this doesn't solve it. It's at the front end, it seems like a simple fix, but it actually is not a simple fix. And so, to be fair, again, if we let the Bible tell us what it's telling us, it does indeed seem to be using days and months and years just the way that we use days and months and years. And when you actually layer it on top of a calendar, it actually works. I'm going to show you that tomorrow morning about these chronogenealogies. So how could such long ages be credible within a Genesis worldview? And there is a fair amount of research that's been done on it. And I'm going to suggest to you 3 lines of research, okay? I'm going to go from the one I find the least plausible to the one that I find the most plausible. I don't turn any of this into a cardinal doctrine of the faith to say we know for sure this is it. I think it could be a combination of these 3 things, and there's probably other factors in play as well. But here's what I figure. I can at least launch you on maybe, if you want to go further with some of these ideas and theories, you could explore them further if you would like. At least you'll kind of know what's on the table in terms of ways that it's being dealt with. Okay, so one of the ways in which one line of avenue research, call it an idea or theory, is based on the concept of genetic deterioration. We know that genetically, things have not been improving over the generations. Rather, the number of mutations and defects in the genetic pool has not been on the decrease, it's been on the increase. And that would be consistent with the Genesis worldview that says that death and corruption and so on, spreading itself out into the human race over succeeding generations, we would expect there would be a downward trend in terms of genetic information, potentially being lost, somehow corrupted, and this can be demonstrated scientifically. Now let's just think about this for just a minute. Adam and Eve would have started out with genetically perfect bodies on a scale that's never been known in modern history, not even recent history. Consider that to be almost like a very high starting point of genetic, I'm going to say, perfection or near perfection. When sin enters into the picture, God makes it clear that the death principle comes into play. They're separated spiritually from God immediately, and their bodies begin to also deteriorate immediately. Add to that the fact that access to the tree of life is blocked for them, so they no longer have whatever that was bringing to the system. And that fruit was bringing something to the system. And so a whole process would begin here, but the deal is they're starting from a very high level of perfection, And so yes, deterioration enters into the world, but they're starting from a very high point. So it would make logical sense that the death process would take a whole lot longer, okay, initially. But with every succeeding generation, this argument goes, with every succeeding generation, each succeeding generation would be starting from an increasingly imperfect starting point. And most people who do the research on it would say that, and I think you will recognize the difference between the idea of a linear graph versus a logarithmic graph. Okay, a linear graph is a straight line rise or a straight line descent. A logarithmic one means the farther along you go, the faster the descent goes. So what this line of idea or theory is that the genetic deterioration began slowly and is accelerating with each succeeding generation. And furthermore, you're starting from a lower and lower level of perfection. And so loss or damage to genetic information is occurring more and more. Gradual increases in genetic mutations and defects would slowly come into play. And so the argument is that this would be, if not the main cause of, age decline, it would be at least a contributor. Okay, it begs the question. The question would be, can you demonstrate a link between aging and genetic defects? And this is a very interesting thing, because the answer is yes. There are modern examples here that I'm going to show you that we can point to that do establish a link between genetic defects and the aging process, even in modern human beings. I'm going to give you two examples. The first example, I want to be very careful how I talk about it, because I'm going to show you some pictures of people who look strange. And that's because they have a disease called progeria. It's a genetic defect, and it causes them to age abnormally fast. And so these pictures are of people, none of whom are beyond the age of 20. They all have progeria, which is an accelerated aging process that's caused by what? Genetic defects. There are less than 250 known cases in the world, at least the last time that I checked. And a couple more pictures here that I personally find quite sad. But here's a young man at only 15 years of age. And this is a young lady of only 16. She died of cardiac complications shortly after this picture was taken. My point in showing you this is to say that here is an example showing that there is indeed a potential link between certain kinds of genetic defects anyway, and the pace at which aging will occur. So I think this guy here, I'm not sure, I don't remember, is a guy named Sam Burns. He was from Foxborough, Massachusetts. He died at the age of 17 in 2014. Before he passed away, they made a film, a documentary of his life. Did anybody see this at all? Anybody hear about it? Life According to Sam? Did somebody see it, actually? I'm going to play you a little clip, okay? Obviously, it's a pretty unique looking guy, and I want to be very respectful of that. My heart goes out to this guy, actually, but a little bit of...
Everyone, thanks for watching Life According to Sam. I'm here with my wife Leslie and with Sam, and we would like to catch you up on what's been happening since the film wrapped.
Some great things have been happening for me. I reached the rank of Eagle Scout in December 2012, and I'm just about to start my junior year of high school, which is exciting, but also a little bit stressful with SATs and AP classes.
Okay, so my point, junior year of high school, but he's in a body that is, he passed away not too long after this. Because the genetic defects had caused tremendous acceleration in the aging process. Now, what this simply establishes is that you can say, yes, indeed, you can envision a scenario where genetic issues could contribute in a lesser fashion than this. Okay, this is dramatic fashion, but to the aging process. So this is one area of exploration. How did the increase in genetic defects and mutations over the generations cause an acceleration in the aging process? Here's another thing, this is even farther outside the scope of my expertise for sure, but it's really interesting in DNA research, the research that's been done on this little thing right here called a telomere. It's a region of repetitive DNA sequences at the end of a chromosome. I mean, you all knew this, right? This is exciting stuff. I mean, amazing. It protects the end of the chromosome from deterioration or from fusion with neighboring chromosomes. Over time, here's the key thing. Due to each cell division, the telomere ends do become shorter. The telomere shortening mechanism normally limits cells to a fixed number of divisions and animal studies suggest that this is responsible for aging on the cellular level and sets a limit on lifespans. That's really interesting. Now, I'm not going to go any deeper into this because, the time to sleep is later in the evening than right now. But, my point simply is, once again, here's another example of how, you know what, we're discovering that there is some linkages between genetics and aging. All right, so that's what I wanted to kind of illustrate.
I spoke to this researcher like a long time ago, and he was telling me, I don't know if this is true or not, but he was telling me about how they found like something that would get rid of the aging process.
Okay.
That'll like stop people from aging.
I've heard claims like that for a long time, I personally do not believe that God's going to allow mankind to resolve the death issue, that we're going to find the magic thing that's going to prevent us from dying, but
It's not that we wouldn't die, it's that we wouldn't age.
prolong life longer. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see. I mean, you can demonstrate that in the last 100 years, lifespans have risen, but that's primarily due to not the fact that our bodies are in better shape, but because we have better medical care. Okay, and we probably eat better, although I'm not so sure sometimes. Okay, so that's one line. Okay, here's a second area and it's related to the first. And that is that there are many, many things over the decades that have been noticed in regards to the aging process that are demonstrating that actually, for whatever reason you want to propose, it can actually be demonstrated that certain processes, at least of aging, are happening faster and faster with every succeeding generation. There are different theories as to why. But this line of research, or call it ideas or theories, is looking into the whys behind this. Let me give you 3 examples. For example, the age at which boys' voices drop. Okay, you all guys remember that experience?
It's hard to hear your own voice when you're
It's a supremely embarrassing thing for me. But anyway, check this out. There's a lot of evidence that human beings age at a slower rate, even in the recent past. For example, boys' voices dropping in pitch at an increasingly earlier age. For example, how many of you guys ever sang in one of these? Would any of you admit to it? I don't know. Okay, boys. I wouldn't pay a lot of money to go listen to a boys choir, but I can handle it. But it's not my favorite form of music. But when it's well done, it can be pretty impressive. Now today, boys choirs still exist. They're not as popular as they were back in the day of, the big age of classical music, etc., etc. But today, you don't see boys much beyond the age of 12-ish, 13-ish. I'm told the average upper limit is about 13 and a half. That a boy could continue in a choir like this. And that would be an average. So for some guys, it would not work. Now what's interesting is that if you back up, and it's historically documented, in the time of Johann Sebastian Bach, I think you're supposed to say that, Johann Sebastian Bach, from 1685 to 1750, okay, let me say those dates again, 1685 to 1750, it's well documented that boys 16 and 17 years of age were still in these choirs. Wow. Their voices hadn't dropped. What is this showing? What it's showing is that it is evidence that a process that marks the beginning of puberty, let's say, one of many, but let's take that one, is happening earlier and earlier and earlier. Meaning what? That boys today are reaching the marker of puberty earlier than they were back in the time of Bach. Okay? So, it's one example. In fact, according to the research, the average age when voices lowered back in those years was actually 17. I can't even, unless it's a really unusual case, I've not met many 17-year-old guys with boys' voices anymore. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but on the ladies' side, the whole menstrual cycle is actually beginning at an increasingly earlier age. Same concept. Same concept. Check this out. Check this out. They did a study. They've done multiple studies on this. They did a study from 1795 all the way to 1981, tracking it in Europe. And the age was dropping 2 to 3 months per decade. 2 to 3 months per decade that girls were reaching that age, faster and faster. They did a similar study in the United States, and the average was 2 months per decade, a little bit slower, okay? In Europe it was 2 to 3 months per decade, here it was 2 months per decade. Another study in the late 1700s and early 1800s, girls were not reaching this point until they were 16. In Japan, they did a study from 1881 to 1970. It dropped from 15.1 down to 12.5. In Denmark, they did a study that goes all the way back to the 1820s. In the 1820s, girls were reaching this at ages 16 and 17, not before. Today in Denmark, the average is 13 years of age. So, you know, these are just data points, okay? These are just pieces of information, but it's showing that for whatever reason, and this is the debate, like, okay, what is causing it? Let's set that aside for a minute. The point is that there's evidence that the human body, generation by generation, for whatever reason, actually is aging faster, or is at least, we could say, reaching markers of age earlier and earlier and earlier. There's a couple of other interesting cases, one that happened here in the United States. I'm sorry, that's the next point. That's the next point. So letter C would be this, that it's many pieces of evidence has been showing that the parts of the human body are wearing out faster and faster. For example, there was an interesting case in Connecticut where a boy who had died at age 13 in the 1700s was unearthed. I don't know why they unearthed the poor guy, but he had died at age 13, okay, so follow this now. I know it's kind of late in the evening. But at 13 years of age, he dies in the 1700s. He's buried in Connecticut. They unburied this guy a few years ago, and his teeth were quite noticeably different and showed the same amount of wear as a modern 9 to 10-year-old. In other words, back in the 1700s, that little piece of data showed that it took 13 years to reach the level of wear, which now takes only 9 to 10 years. Now you say, well, that's an isolated case, and that's true, it's an isolated case, but one of the interesting things, let's talk about teeth for a minute, is that they have found that in a lot of the ancient skulls that have been examined, the enamel, the amount of enamel on the teeth is much thicker than what we have today. So today we have far more dense, and in fact, there's a lot less cavities in them. Now we could argue that's because we eat a lot more sugar and bad food, and there's probably some truth to that. But the thickness of the enamel is remarkable, and it's not just in an isolated case. So even things like the acuity of vision, there seems to be evidence as well of how people handled themselves in the past that suggests that eyesight was better in much earlier generations. So this line of reasoning, this theory, okay, this whole category is studying that. Okay, what could be the cause of that? Because there does seem to be evidence that the human body is wearing out faster and faster. Okay, we come to number 3. This is the one that personally I think has the most interest and merit to it, and that is the effects of the flood on the world's climate. This to me is like, whether you would like to notice it, you kind of don't have the choice, but to notice that the flood had some sort of impact. Why would I say that? Well, here is a chart of ages, okay? So you have Adam reaching 930 years, Seth, Enosh, and so on. Enoch doesn't live very long compared to the others. Why? Because he's taken up by God. Methuselah, the longest recorded human being, by the way, the year he died is the year that the flood came. And there's reason for that. Lamech, it has to do with what his name means. Lamech, the father of Noah, and then Noah, who lives all the way over to here. Okay, and then you have the ages of the descendants of what's happening.
Tremendously short.
Yeah, it's getting shorter and shorter. Here's another chart, okay, tracing some ages of some well-known figures all the way up to pretty close to where we are. And here, of course, is the year 0. Where does the flood fit in here? The flood fits right here. So it's really difficult to not notice the very probable connection between the flood and the aging process. I mean, at the very least, it seems to have already been declining somewhat, but the acceleration rate is pretty dramatic after the flood. And so this has led a lot of people, and I think rightly so, to say, wait a second, like, are there ways in which the flood impacted the world that we're not thinking about? You know, it's hard to imagine how, for example, okay, a bunch of water came by here and messed up the ground, and that caused people to age faster. Probably not. But could the flood have had other side effects that would have led to a significant impact on aging? And that's where the research is. And that's where I find the most interesting answers to be found. And where do the answers lie? They lie in the whole area. This is the proposal, okay? That the flood brought about climate change on a scale that like makes anything in modern era pale. I mean, just completely different, off the charts rate. In two specific areas. So those areas are atmospheric pressure and oxygen content. The atmospheric pressure and the oxygen content of our atmosphere. And so this really intriguing line of exploration has to do with what would have happened if the flood, and perhaps caused by the collapse of the water canopy, if there was such a thing or something like it, and maybe other factors that haven't been fully understood, what would have happened if the pressure in the atmosphere had been modified and if the oxygen content of the atmosphere had been messed with? Would that have impacted aging? And the answer is pretty well a resounding yes. And I'm going to show you a few things here. So for example, this is taken out of Time magazine over 30 years ago now, but there's more recent examples of it too. But I like these particular pictures. They found these blocks of resin with bubbles of air inside of it, which obviously come from a long time ago. Now some would say it's millions of years, okay? I wouldn't play with that scale, but notice what they say. This is Time magazine. Dinosaurs, it seems, may have breathed easier than we do. Indeed, at a meeting of the Geological Society of America in Phoenix last week, two scientists stunned colleagues by reporting that 80 million years ago, the Earth's atmosphere contained about 50% more oxygen than it does now. How did they figure that out? Geochemists Gary Landis, so on and so forth, reached their startling conclusion after analyzing tiny air bubbles trapped in bits of amber, the aged and solidified resin of coniferous trees. They placed the amber inside a vacuum chamber, cracked it to let the ancient air escape. They found that it was 32% oxygen compared with 21% in the modern atmosphere. And so this has led to a lot of more research on this. Here's another one. A Yale study published in March 3rd, 2000 issue of Science independently confirmed high levels of oxygen present in the Earth's distant past. Some have even suggested that without such an atmosphere, the relatively small lung capacity in certain dinosaurs could not have supplied their massive tissue with the needed oxygen. That's an interesting statement there. Let's say that you had a big animal like a dinosaur that was designed for a certain atmospheric pressure and oxygen content, and its lung capacity was adapted for that. And suddenly you change the rules of the game by changing how much oxygen it gets with every breath. Would it impact every animal? Yeah. Which animals will be impacted the most? The answer is the largest ones. So could it be that something like the extinction of the dinosaurs could at least have had as a major contributing factor, maybe not the only factor, something as simple as that? That the atmosphere in which these animals found themselves as they came off the ark and grew to adulthood, and therefore their lung capacity went all, size went all the way up, they suddenly found themselves in a world where they're no longer adapted to that kind of an environment. And so they eventually begin to, I'm sure it isn't an overnight process, but they eventually begin to find it more and more difficult to function. Could it be? Actually, it could be. It's also interesting to notice a few things like this, like pterodactyls. These are often cited as examples of transitional forms, meaning what? They're half bird and half something else. Why? Well, they don't have the wings to actually fly, so why would they have wings? Well, maybe they're halfway to becoming flyable animals. What would would happen if the atmospheric pressure was higher and the atmosphere was thicker? A bird with smaller wings would be able to get off the ground. I know this from being a pilot. Like when I fly, I actually like to fly in the evening or the early morning. You know why? Because the atmosphere is more dense. I get way better lift off the wings. And if I'm bringing somebody who's blessed with a little more girth than I have, I actually really prefer to fly in the evening because I can get more weight off the ground, and no disrespect intended. It's just the reality. So people have not mocked, it's not the right word, but they've suggested that this thing could not possibly fly. Why? Because it would not have had big enough wings. Yeah, but that's in your atmosphere today. What would happen if the atmosphere was thicker? Citing evidence of denser atmosphere in the past, Harold Morris postulates that this vapor layer could have dramatically increased the atmospheric pressure on the surface of the early Earth, again contributing to a healthier environment, like a natural hyperbaric chamber. I'm going to come back to that in a second. This could perhaps explain how an ungainly pterosaur with stubby wings could fly. It could provide an explanation. Now let me come back to this hyperbaric thing. What is a hyperbaric chamber? This is a hyperbaric chamber. I don't know how many of you know anything about this, but in a hyperbaric chamber, you know what they do? They put people in here who have had some forms of injury, and they do two things. Guess what it is? They increase the atmospheric pressure and the oxygen content. You know what it does? It accelerates the healing process. Not in a small way, in a big enough way to merit doing this. This is demonstrating what? That higher atmospheric pressure, higher oxygen content, better health. So going back to our aging thing, this is the line of reasoning. Could it be that huge climate change could have contributed to not just aging in human beings, but real challenges for many animals as well? I don't know if you realize this, but there is a lot of evidence that the atmosphere developing in the early years was very different than it is today. At one time, the entire Earth enjoyed a warm tropical environment, tons of evidence of that, and there was enhanced oxygen in the atmosphere. Organisms lived healthier, longer, and grew much larger as a result. For example, here is a shark's mouth, jaw, that you can visit at a museum here in Florida. Actually, I believe it's down in Tampa. I've actually seen that. We don't have sharks that big anymore today. Praise the Lord. Except the movies. Except the movies. What's the movie they had out years ago?
That's much better than eating, like eating an orange.
Here's the tooth off of one of those.
Look at that. That goes right through your heart.
Here's another one. Actually, this is the one that's down in Tampa. It's a different one, sorry. Museum of Science and Industry. And this guy is pretty freaked out, just touching the one tooth. Here is a fossil of an ant next to a modern hummingbird.
No, thank you.
That is a huge ant.
Look how yummy that is.
How did we get that big?
I've done simulations of this. If you put
Here is a giant sloth. Here's a fossilized sloth claw compared to a modern sloth claw. Here is a trilobite. Modern trilobites are about the size, not even the size of a penny. That's a pretty massive trilobite. Giant marine fossils. We don't have this particular species in this size anymore. Here are giant clam fossils. A lot of these, by the way, have been found on very tall, very high mountains. Here are bones of obviously massively huge animals. I mean, you would need a tremendous amount of food, a tremendous amount of oxygen to be able to support this kind of an organism. Here is a giant ammonite fossil. This is the largest ammonite fossil ever found. It's in the museum in Utah. I mean, this is not even remotely close to anything that we know today. This is a dragonfly that's 30 inches across. So,
a couple of small babies. Take it away. Dragonflies bite.
what I find amazing, by the way, with this picture is that the state of preservation of the fossilization is so excellent that you can actually see the ribbing in those little teeny fine, super thin wings. This thing had to have been buried very rapidly and brought under pressure very rapidly. I mean, when a dragonfly dies, what happens? It falls to the ground and over millions of years it fossilizes? Of course not. The only way you get this kind of state of preservation is rapid burial. And there are literally tens of thousands of highly preserved fossils that were very rapidly buried. We're going to go there a bit more tomorrow. But that's amazing, a 30-inch dragonfly. The discovery of a giant fossilized claw, this is Science Daily 2007, discovery of a giant fossilized claw from an ancient sea scorpion indicates that when alive it would have been about 2.5 meters long, much taller than the average man. We have known for some time, said the scientists, that the fossil record yields monster millipedes, supersized scorpions, colossal cockroaches, and jumbo dragonflies. In October 2006, Science Daily publicized a study led by Arizona State University staff entitled "Giant Insects Might Reign If Only There Was More Oxygen in the Air." The article claims, quote, "The delicate ladybug in your garden could be frighteningly large if only there was a greater concentration of oxygen in the air." A new study concludes the study had support to the theory that some insects were much larger during the late Paleozoic period because they had a much richer oxygen supply, said the study's lead, and so on. Time of huge and abundant plant life, rather large insects, dragonflies had 2.5-foot wingspans, for example. The air's oxygen content was 35% compared to 21% today. This research concurs with the biblical model of the early Earth. Not millions of years, okay, but earlier. And I'll give you one last one here. In 2010, researchers at Arizona State University presented the results of experiments raising insects in various levels of atmospheric oxygen. 10 out of 12 varieties of insects studied decreased in size with lower oxygen. Some, like dragonflies, grew faster. They became bigger in an enriched oxygen atmosphere. Point being what? Point being that, there seems to be a fair amount of validity to the notion that this climate change thing is a very viable option for explaining why lifespans would have decreased, why sizes of animals would have decreased, why some very large animals could have gone extinct over time. It's interesting that even in the scriptures, when you go to chapter 8, verse 22, it talks about the climate. And it almost seems to suggest that the climate of the world somehow changed quite a bit after the flood. And it's really interesting, and let me take you down a couple of lines of thought here, and then I'm going to wrap this up, because my goal isn't, there's no way we can answer all the questions for sure, but these are the big lines of thought and reasoning. Like drastic seasonal changes were likely unknown prior to the flood. A short ice age would have ensued while the Earth regained a state of equilibrium. This would have been precipitated by the warming of the oceans and volcanic activity dumping ash into the upper atmosphere, leading to lower global temperatures. You realize that there's all kinds of models, computer models that have been run on what would happen if you flooded the Earth with a global flood like described in the Bible. And every one of those models demonstrates that it would have taken at least 200, and in some cases up to 600 years for the Earth to stabilize after an event like that. And a lot of things would have happened that we don't intuitively think about. And one of those is what's just being described here. The volcanism that would have been launched, the results of that volcanic activity. The modeling even predicts where the ice would have gone after a flood like that. It predicts what would have happened with ocean levels, how the ocean levels would initially not have been as high as they are today, because it would have taken decades for the water levels to stabilize after a global event like that. There would have been huge bodies of inland water trapped at various places. And it could have taken upwards of I've seen models that will take it all the way up to 200, 300, 400 years before the water levels begin to stabilize. So what would that lead to? That would lead to ocean levels being lower. It would lead to the shorelines being much farther out back than they are today. So for example, here is one computer model, and you take a look at just the state of Florida, much wider than it is today. We often think that when we reach to the edge of the water, we reach the edge of the continent. We haven't. Where do you reach the edge of the continent? You have to go out a ways till you reach the edge of the continental shelf. That's the edge of the continent. So the idea is that in these different models of research, it's like, okay, this is what we would see, that it would take, and you have different predictions, but it would take quite a while for those water levels to come up. So let's say that it takes 100 years for the water levels to come up to what they are today. I've never seen one that low. I've seen them all in the 200 to 400 year range. So what would happen? Well, people would get off the boat, people would begin multiplying, and how would people get, from Europe over into North America? Answer, they would walk. Because you lower the ocean level by not very far, and guess what? Alaska is connected to Russia. It's just that the land bridge is under today's water level. But you take the water level down, look at how Australia is connected to its neighbors. Much different than what we see today. The distances which have been much shorter. There's an entire continent that is largely submerged today, in fact almost entirely submerged today. Right here, they actually have a name for it, I forget what it is. But the geography after the Ice Age would have been very different. It would have ultimately landed to be something like this, where all these shorelines become submerged. Okay, let's follow the logic of this a little bit. If this follows, then we would expect to find what? We would expect to find many, many, many evidences of people living out on what used to be the edge of their continent, but now their cities are submerged. And guess what? In all of these red zones, we find dozens and dozens of submerged cities that are out on the edge of continental shelving, and obviously when people used to live there, the water was not over top their heads. But today it is. And it's just really fascinating to see these red zones where they have found evidence of human occupation. Oh yeah, it's called Zealandia. 1.74 million square miles. It's 94% submerged today, but it's actually an entire continent if you just lower the level of the ocean a little bit. When the Ice Age was ending, the sea level rose about 3 feet per year is the prediction. Almost all the sea level rise within a century, engulfing about 25 million square miles of coastal real estate. With catastrophic though gradual climate change when the Middle East, Northwest India, and North Africa turned from green to desert as the cloud cover for the Ice Age was dissipating. Plato said that much of Greece was consumed by the sea too. The flood of Ogyges at the time of the destruction of Atlantis. You all heard about the sinking city of Atlantis, like it's a legend, but could it be based in some fact? Very likely it is. So he talks about this empire that extended both outside and inside the Pillars of Hercules, inside as far as Italy and Libya. Have you ever seen a map showing the Bronze Age port cities of the world? You certainly have not, because the Darwinists will tell you that sea level circa 2000 BC was a little different than today. Yet the presence of hundreds of submerged ruin sites from the Gulf of Chambay to Bimini and from Cornwall to Nan Madol certainly belie that notion. With most of the submerged ruins worldwide in the Mediterranean and Eastern Atlantic, right where you would expect them to be, where Sidon, Peleg, Javan, Tarshish, and Atlas plied the waters, building their port facilities, now submerged since the end of the Ice Age. And many have heard of the fabulously extensive and massive basalt column buildings of Nan Madol on the island of whatever that is, the Caroline Islands of the Western Pacific. Yet offshore, there's the real story, submerged ruins down to 100 feet, even vertical columns still standing, submerged since the end of the Ice Age. This is a map of this city that's now submerged, because ocean levels rose dramatically at some point. That's exactly what's predicted in the modeling of a global flood. And so if you go down below the water today, you see the remains of these particular structures. There's the ruins of the old Kami. Many believe that that's named after Ham, the son of Noah, potentially, who settled in that, or whose descendants settled. I mean, look at these structures all below water today. Wow. They were once inhabited. I mean, look at the size of that diver, okay, compared to these cut structures here. Underwater ruins off the coast of India, and so on and so forth. So, but then people say, well, wait a second, like, okay, let's take a look at the Ice Age thing. Like, it takes thousands of years, doesn't it, to form thick ice sheets? Maybe not. Doesn't it take thousands of years to form thick ice sheets? Well, here's an interesting story that some of you no doubt heard about the submerged airplanes. Remember that one? Anybody know about that one? So real quick, in the Second World War, some of these planes called the P-38 Lightning, which I'd love to get my hand on one of those, they were lost. On the 15th of July 1942, a group of 6 of those and 2 B-17 aircraft were forced to land in Greenland during a severe snowstorm. The damaged planes were then abandoned. Okay, remember the date, 1942. They were abandoned, 1942. 50 years later, a research expedition was sent out to try to locate and possibly salvage the aircraft. Initially, it was thought that this would be a relatively simple task. since they were not expected to be buried very deeply. A little snow removal, minor maintenance, fresh tanks of fuel, and off they would go. This scenario seemed probable, given the fact that according to the popular theory, thousands of years would be required to bury them very deeply. After a lengthy and frustrating search, the planes were finally located under 250 feet of solid ice, which had accumulated in 50 years. Furthermore, the ice had transported them a distance of 3 miles from their point of origin. They actually melted a shaft all the way down to get one of them. 26-story building in 50 years. And that's a picture of them way down in the ice. They literally used heat equipment to melt around the body of the aircraft. They took it apart and they brought it up piece by piece and they restored it. And October 26, 2002, it flew once again with 80% of its original parts. You know what they named the plane? They named it Glacier Girl. And because I like airplanes, I thought I'm going to play the takeoff. Now, I think this is evidence that Cro-Magnon man was building P-38 Lightnings, right? No. Took only 50 years to get 250 feet of ice. So this notion that just because you have a thick ice sheet, you have evidence of millions of years, just doesn't hold to something like this. Now a revitalized search effort led by the nonprofit whatever has discovered another one of those, and this is in 2011 they first detected it, and there's a whole other project to try to unearth that. So what's my point in stating all of this stuff? I mean, I went further than our topic for this evening, although I believe it's related. I think one of the avenues that is the most promising to answer the question of what happened to the long age spans, has to do with climate change. I think that there's probably factors we've never even thought about. Certainly the issue of oxygen content and atmospheric pressure seem to be very promising avenues of research that could lend answers to this. But in the bigger scheme of things, what I also wanted to paint a picture of tonight was that there is evidence at many levels. To me, it's like an onion. You peel it back, you find more and more stuff. There's evidence at many levels that our world went through like much more dramatic change than probably most of us have ever imagined. I don't know how many of you have actually seen the power of moving water up close. I think many of you probably have. In our lifetimes, we have witnessed 2, if not 3 major tsunamis. I remember I was flying to Japan the day of the 2011 tsunami. My flight had to be delayed. I got there at the Narita airport, and we were still feeling aftershocks when we got there. And we were hearing the reports of the thousands of people that died. And yet if you look at pictures of it, you know, honestly, the wave is fairly big, but not really when you look at the overall scale of things. Like if you're looking at it from the air, it looks like a small little wave. And it took like thousands upon, I think the number is over 20,000 people who died. And that's not even a global flood. I mean, it's not even close to a global flood. So you take that, extrapolate that out to a scale that's global, and you factor in many things that things like modern computer modeling bring to the table, and it's like, wow, we really are not thinking very deeply if we think that a couple weeks after the flood, it's back to business as usual. The Grand Canyon was almost certainly formed, for example, during this period of time, when tremendous amounts of water were rushing off the landscape of recently layered sedimentary layers that were laid down by the flood. No, it takes millions of years to do that. No, it doesn't. In 1981, it was at 8081, Mount St. Helens blew up, and the flooding that resulted carved canyons extremely deep within a matter of months. And it looked like a small Grand Canyon. And you would have looked at it and said, well, clearly it's millions and billions of years. By the way, here's just another thing. These layers are so smooth and flat. They're supposed to be evidence of millions of years. How come they stayed so pristine smooth with no erosion for millions of years, waiting for the next layer to come on top? No erosion for millions of years while we wait for the next layer to come on top. No erosion for millions of years, the next layer doesn't make any sense. But the sifting out of sediment by density and the layering of it rather rapidly would have buried millions of animals under mud, etc., etc. You'd have water flowing to it. Anyway, I'm starting to digress too far. But the whole climate change thing has to be huge. And that's the third and final category of research. Okay, I'm going to end with this. This to me is super intriguing. A few years ago I ran across this book called Buried Alive. It's written by a guy named Jack Quazzo. I don't know this is a few years back, so I'm not sure if he's still practicing. But his area of expertise was, and I'm sure I'm not going to get it correct, but he's like an orthodontist reconstruction kind of guy. His area of expertise is reconstructing human jaws. So he is intrigued by these skulls that are supposedly of ancient humans. And he's a Christian. And so he wants to explore this further, especially given his area of expertise. So he gains permission to get access to some of these skulls in museums in Europe. He's going in there with a Christian agenda, which he doesn't really put on the table up front. And there's a fascinating part to this story where he tells how they discover what he's really trying to demonstrate, and then he gets run out of these museums. He actually has to flee the country. But anyway, as he goes in here, he realizes, even to his great surprise, that these skulls have been deliberately misconstructed. They are not reconstructed properly. However, it's still true nonetheless that the skulls don't appear to be really entirely human. While at the same time, they don't entirely appear necessarily to be entirely ape either. They seem to be between the two. And that has to be admitted. So of course that seems to lend support to the evolutionary theory of transitional forms, where apes gradually turned into human beings, and so you have these half ape, half human skulls. Except he then comes out with this amazing thought, and this is what I found really intriguing, and I'll leave it with you in closing this evening. He says, here's an interesting reality that most of my readers probably have never realized. He says, there is a part of the human body that never stops physically growing. Do you know what it is? The head. You say, yeah, I know people with really big heads the older they get. I mean, arrogance-wise. No, he meant physically. And he said, if you want proof of it, he said, take a ball cap and adjust it for your head size at age 25 and then hang it up for 50 years. And at age 75, try to put it back on and you won't be able to. Because he said the head continually expands. Slowly, but it continually expands. Particularly the forehead, which tends to flatten and come forward. And the jaws, which also tend to expand, and also do tend to move, oftentimes forward. So then he proposes the following fascinating thing. He said, today, the average lifespan is whatever, 70-ish, I don't know exactly what it is. So that means that after 70 years, this process of the skull changing is stopped, and you die. Well, what would happen if you didn't die till 200, or you didn't die till 300, or you didn't die till 500, or you didn't die till 700? What would happen to your head? You would end up with a pretty interesting looking skull. He said actually what you would end up with would be a skull that kind of looks like a half ape, half human. So he says, my proposal, my theory, and I'm simplifying this, and by the way, this is a book that if you need help falling asleep at night, get it, buy it, and read it. It will help you with your insomnia, because it gets really technical. I have a dentist friend who practices down in Florida, but he's from Quebec, and he was doing his doctorate. He said, I want to read this book. And he read it, and he was like thrilled beyond thrilled, because it was really talking his language, okay? But here's the main thing. What he's saying is, he's convinced that it's a very real possibility that these skulls that we're seeing are actually the skulls of ancient human beings who lived into the hundreds of years of age. And we dig them up today, and because we've never seen the likes of it, we just jump to a conclusion that, you know what, there must be somehow a half ape, half human. He said, I believe it's a very real possibility that these are the skulls of fully human beings, but who hadn't died till 400, 500, 600 years of age. And so of course their skulls continuing to grow, go into shapes that we've never seen of a human skull today. I don't know if he's right. I don't think you can prove that he's wrong. I just find that a really, really fascinating thought. And to me, it's an illustration of how easy it is to fail to think outside the box. Right? We so easily take our modern experience and just superimpose it upon the past. And we can easily make mistakes there because we assume the conditions were the same. Or we never stop to think about what the effect of aging might be on a human skull, for example. And so one of the things I find fascinating in all of this is to take time to really think, get your thinking pushed a little bit, do some reading, start to ask yourself questions. Okay, well, what would happen if the conditions were different? And it's interesting how pieces start to make sense. They kind of start to fit together. And so I hope that you found some of this interesting. Again, my goal tonight was, oh yeah, here by the way is a kind of a representation of that changing of the head. And so that's why in my slide that I had this weird looking guy who's, you know, maybe 400 years old, you know, whose face kind of looks a little bit strange compared to what we might know today. Okay, so my goal was to say, okay, here are 3 big lines of research that are bringing some interesting potential answers to the table about human longevity. It's interesting that when you read the prophetic scriptures, it talks about the fact that human longevity will rise once again during the millennial age. It says that the child will die 100 years old. Today, if somebody dies at 100, you don't call that person a child. But if you're supposed to live to 1,000, let's say, and you die at 100, you'd be considered young, right? So it's just kind of interesting. There will not be an infant from there live but a few days, nor an old man who has not fulfilled his days, for the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. This is a millennial text. And so it would seem that in the millennial age, human longevity is going to increase once again. All right, so I'm done. I'm around to stick around if people want to talk some more about some of these interesting ideas. And have yourselves a great night.